Well, welcome everyone. I'm Antidote Judith, and Michael Wayne and I have been doing this interview series for about 3 years now. First, the Visioneering of the Future, and now Voices for the Future. But today, instead of Michael and I interviewing a guest, I'm going to interview Michael because he has a brand new book that is just out that I have just read for the second time, and I am extremely impressed with it. And I'm not an easy sell on books. I'm a very harsh critic of writing and books. And so I'm really excited to bring forth these ideas because I think he's put together a lot of the dots that make sense of our current situation. And not only that, but has a plan for how to get out of it. So if you're not familiar with Michael Wayne, PhD and a licensed acupuncturist, is the author of 5 books. He's a filmmaker and a host and a producer of Interviews at the Leading Edge, featuring dialogues with thought leaders and change agents like John Perkins, Peter Yarrow, Charles Eisenstein, Corinna Gore, Barbara Marx Hubbard when she was alive, Catherine Woodward Thomas, Matthew Fox, and myself. Since 2020, Dr. Wayne has we've collaborated on this Visioneering for the Future. And his film credits include the feature documentary film On the Path to Strawberry Fields, which explores present-day issues and shows a path forward to a positive future. Michael's also a practitioner of acupuncture, Chinese medicine, and integrative medicine, and a member of the organization Evolutionary Leaders, an alliance of thought leaders, activists, and change agents started by Deepak Chopra in 2006. And he's calling in from Saratoga Springs, New York.
Yeah,
So welcome, Michael, to your own show.
Oh, thank you, Anna Day. It's as I said to you before we start, it's a funny feeling to be on the other side of the interviewing.
Well, I think it's a fantastic book. I'm going to hold it up for people to see. Toward a More Perfect Union, From Scarcity to Abundance for All. And it's a jam-packed with information. Having read it the second time, it was like it was all new. And I could read it a third and fourth time about how we got to this world of scarcity and all the pieces that put that together and where we can go from here. So what inspired you to write this book, and what's the significance of the title? So tell us your story about how it came about.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what inspired me writing it. There were 2 factors. One, going back years to as I started practicing Chinese medicine, acupuncture, Chinese medicine, integrative medicine, having people come to see me. And at first I just looked at, maybe I was a little more naive or thinking, oh, maybe I had my head in the sand. But as people came to see me and I saw the wonders of what acupuncture, Chinese medicine could do, I said, there's something wrong with this medical economic model in that why aren't insurance companies covering this wholeheartedly and instead putting out scads of money, boatloads of money paying for the Western medical standard stuff of drugs and treatments and imaging and surgeries. So as I said, I was a little bit naive, and then just as I started understanding how the model works more and more, and seeing that it's just such a profit-driven system, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And anyone who visits doctors knows that the doctor, and it's not always the doctor's fault necessarily, but the doctor does not have a lot of time to spend with you, can't really get to know you, and just writes the prescription, leaves, or and just a lot of people feel very frustrated by the system. And so it's just a system that doesn't work, and the outcomes of it is just the poor health outcomes of the American population, and the obscene amounts of money that's spent in the American healthcare system. The American healthcare system spends about $4 trillion a year on health expenditures, twice as much as any other country. And the healthcare system is about 20% of GDP. So it's a great way to get rich if you want to become a billionaire. Like the richest senator, I believe the richest senator in the United States Senate is Rick Scott from Florida, the Republican from Florida. And he used to be the CEO of a healthcare company that owned hospitals. So it's big bucks. So that was one part. And then also that fact that I was advocating people to become healthy, trying to help them. And for some people, a lot of hand holding. So people just don't even understand, a lot of people just are deprived of knowledge of how to become healthier. So I said that was one factor. And the second factor is, as you mentioned, Anna Day, in reading my bio about my feature documentary film I made a few years ago, and that's how we met when I first interviewed for my Interviews with the Leading Edge series, On the Path to Strawberry Fields. And the film was a very hopeful way of looking at how we can find a path forward, just like we're talking tonight in my book. But I think it was incomplete, as a lot of the solution was about how we can evolve human evolution and evolving consciousness to just kind of see the world in a bigger way, a more sophisticated way, and we can create a better society just through human evolution and I said consciousness. And I came to realize that's not enough. It's not enough. We're not going to yoga and meditate our way out of it, even though all those are great, or chew brown rice. I love chewing brown rice, but we need structural change in our society. And structural change can change the narrative as society, as I talk about in my book, and we'll probably talk about tonight. And it can change how people think. So those two factors. And then the title of my book, Toward a More Perfect Union, comes right out of the preamble of the Constitution of the United States. It says, "We the people, in order to create a more perfect union." And that is the aspiration, and that was written kind of as the second part of the aspiration. The first part being the Declaration of the United States. It said people are imbued with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Both those ideas come from the Enlightenment, that period of time when people were the great Enlightenment thinkers, and people were very focused on the aspirational human. And then the subtitle, From Scarcity to Abundance for All, is those terms are both terms in economics and psychology, because there's parts of our, psychologically speaking, parts of our brain that are hardwired to be more scarcity thinking, and parts that are more abundance thinking. And abundance thinking is really whole person, wholehearted, whole mind. And then in economics, our capitalist system is very much scarcity oriented. And as I make the argument in my book, we can shift it around to a more abundance. There's enough to go around within the, there's finite resources, air, water, soil, that we need to protect. But then there's how we take care of people. There's enough to go around, and it's a change of mindset to create that from scarcity to abundance and for all.
And you do map out a path of how to get there. So
yeah, and I'll say one more thing on that. In our society now, there is abundance, but it's just abundance for a few, the privileged, and the rest, everyone else gets scarcity. For example, tying it into very current events, the upcoming purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk for $44 billion. Yeah, that's no chump change. And Musk is funding, I think like half of it he's funding from himself, his stocks and Tesla and whatever else. But the rest is coming from the financiers, the
Mhm,
finance industry.
mhm.
So, and he had no problem raising it. So abundance for Elon Musk, the privileged
Yeah.
few. But
Yeah, and then he can change, whether Trump's on Twitter or not, and
yeah, that's a whole, yeah, that there's a two-pronged problem with Elon Musk buying Twitter.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, let's get back into your book and begin on some of the details of the different dots you draw together. You talk about the financial crash of 2008 and how Alan Greenspan admitted that there was a flaw in his thinking, that it was like, oh, why did this happen? There was something I missed. And then he wasn't the only one that carried this flaw into the economic philosophies, because you go all the way back to James Madison, you go through Ayn Rand, you include Charles Koch of the Koch brothers. So, what is this flaw and how did we miss it?
Yeah, again, it's kind of like human psychology and scarcity thinking. I mean, he started with Alan Greenspan, and he said in 2008, as I write about, when he was testifying in front of Congress about the financial crash, and he was no longer, Alan Greenspan was the head of the Federal Reserve for I think 20 years, the longest the longest reign of the Federal Reserve, I believe. But he said to Congress, he said that I realized there was a flaw in my thinking. And the Congress, the committee, listening to that, just kind of, I said, oh, heads exploded, because they're like, a flaw? What the hell is that? And what he said was, there was a flaw in my guiding philosophy that I thought the banks could self-regulate and look out for, I'm paraphrasing, but look out for the common good and would never do anything malfeasant or do anything crooked, because they would take care of everybody. And as we know, the financial crash was caused by the banks just after one thing, and that was the moolah, just lots of money. So tracing it back, as you said, like, I kind of give a historical lineage of this flaw. I mean, and you said, mentioned James Madison, who wrote the U.S. Constitution. He had the same flaw, or a flaw, a little different flaw, in that he believed that James Madison wrote the Constitution, and he was mentored by Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson perhaps would have had a hand in writing the Constitution, but he served as the ambassador to France for 1785 to 1789. So he wasn't around when the Constitution was being written, but he and Madison corresponded. But back in those days, there was no text messaging or emailing. So it took a little bit of time for the letters to go back and forth. Jefferson was having a great time commingling with the French Enlightenment thinkers in France. And Madison was, even though he was also imbued with Enlightenment thinking, he was also an aristocrat, somewhat sickly. And so he felt that in writing the Constitution, it was very important to protect the minority. And I don't mean minority like people of color minority, but the minority was the property owners and slave owners. And so Madison had this
The
term,
elite minority.
the elite, yeah, the privileged, the Elon Musks of their time. Yeah. And so Madison had this belief in the tyranny of the majority, that if we give the majority too many rights, there'll be mob rule and they'll come after us with the pitchforks and there'll be a revolution. And the majority had, the majority were slaves, women, farmers, artisans, mercantile people, that they didn't have any power. But Madison felt, so in his mind, this flaw, he felt we got to protect the minority. And actually, tracing the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment goes back to the time, or the lineage of the Enlightenment goes back to to the time of the ancient Greek philosophers, and of which there's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the big three. And they also talked about freedom and democracy. And Greece was, for a period, was the first true democracy in the world. So
Except it didn't include women.
yeah, they didn't. Yeah, I mean, a flawed democracy, and just like now. And so both Aristotle and Madison were students of democracy, and also felt that property owners were imbued in democracy, had a say. But Aristotle felt that you had to restrict property owners to let democracy flourish, where Madison felt you had to restrict democracy to let property owners flourish. Mm-hmm. So the Constitution was written with the tyranny of the minority in the mind, and and
it's still what's going on today with the Republicans trying to suppress the right to vote. That they don't want they don't want what they call the minorities, which is blacks or people of color. They don't want them to vote because their minority leadership, they actually represent a minority of the country, especially in the Senate, and they're trying to keep that rule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the tyranny of the minority are the nowadays we just call them the oligarchs, the plutocrats, and they use their money to dictate public policy. And it's been going on a long time, and it just keeps going. And so everyone else is, and the majority of people want more a liberal democracy, and the tyranny of minority wants an illiberal democracy. It's like the conservative political action, whatever it's called, the CPAC. They're having their upcoming conference in Hungary, of all places, because it's the home of illiberal democracy.
Yeah. And the majority of people want something to be done about climate change, and they want something to be done about gun control, and yet that's not happening. So so you go into a lot of, like I say, economic connecting the dots of how we got into this wildly unequal system that we have now. And you draw some, dots through different periods of history. One of them is you talk about the economic Gilded Age in the late 19th century. And but now with neoliberalism, we have a similar thing to the Gilded Age, and you draw a parallel there. So tell us about neoliberalism for people who might not know what you mean by that. And then what's the same and what's different about these Gilded Ages?
Well, it's probably pretty similar. The common denominator is pretty much the wealth inequality, wealth and income inequality that runs through both of them. And now it's the levels of wealth inequality are extreme and really obscene when you have the 50 wealthiest Americans having just as much wealth as 50% of the American population. And so it's similar to the Gilded Age in that regard. In the Gilded Age, there were the robber barons, a certain clique of people who had most of the money, most of the power, and then the rest of the population living in poverty. And the difference then was that the working class were working in factories and mines for the robber barons, getting paid terribly in horrible working conditions, in long hours. And the Gilded Age gave birth to the so-called progressive era, starting in about 1900 for about 20 years, in which many reforms took place. That's when women, one of the last of the reforms over 20 years, women were given the right to vote. United States senators were directly elected instead of appointed by backroom deal making. And it was always kind of, again, plutocrats who became senators before senators were directly elected. Labor laws went into effect. A progressive income tax was put in. Before that, when the United States was down on their luck money-wise, they borrowed money from the wealthy class then. So and now, so it's not exactly that. And another thing that got put in then was all the strong antitrust laws that broke up the big trusts, the big corporations that were just running the show. There was such an upswing and a groundswell of support for progressive lawmaking. So people were very happy to see the robber barons broken apart. And then just with this age of neoliberalism that began with in the mid 70s, but went full tilt with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 and Margaret Thatcher right around the same time in England. Antitrust laws were weakened, and unions been weakened, and I said wealth inequality has just gone through the roof.
Yeah, there was a lot of deregulation.
Deregulation, yeah, and we're seeing the results. And COVID was kind of a byproduct of it. COVID was a byproduct of many variables, but deregulation played a big role.
Yeah. So you talk about neoliberalism. So tell us what you mean by that, and
So
how is
yeah,
that? Yeah.
uh, so neoliberalism was a term that was coined, I don't know, maybe in the 80s, but it started as an idea by an Austrian economist who fled Austria as World War II was happening and lived in England and also Chicago, Friedrich Hayek. And he wrote a book, The Path to Freedom, I think. It was actually, and he got a lot of funding from the wealthy who were upset about what Roosevelt was doing in the United States because they saw it as socialism. But the term itself, and so then it just continues from there, picked up steam. And many people know about Milton Friedman and supply side economics that Reagan brought in, that his running mate George Bush at one time called voodoo economics, and sometimes we call it trickle down economics. But the interesting thing about the idea of neoliberalism is there's a certain aspiration or idealistic concept in it. For instance, Milton Friedman wrote a book called Free to Choose, I think it was. It was a book and a 10-part PBS series, and it captured, for some people, it captured their imagination. Because the nice sound, the Shangri-La part of neoliberalism, Shangri-La sounding part of neoliberalism is that it's about people being free to be who they want to be. And who could be against that? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's part of the DNA of America.
Yeah. And people in general. But the idea is to get there, we take away restrictions. We limit government, and we give people the tools to aspire to be who they want to be and make as much money as they want to be. Want. So it's pretty much a free market reigns. Corporations should reign. Everybody should just make as much money as they want, and all the world's problems will be solved.
And how does that differ from libertarianism?
Well, it's tied in with libertarianism. Libertarians used to be kind of the cranky extreme right, but now they're kind of the mainstream, and they're in Republican, right wing, conservative thinking, whatever. Yeah, and actually the far right now is the so-called alt-right that promotes all kinds of conspiracy theories and talks about the elites that were coming after us and all this stuff. That's a whole nother story, and I go into my book. But libertarianism, like Charles Koch, who I devote a whole chapter to, was really pushing that libertarian philosophy. But so the terms can be interchanged: libertarian, neoliberalism. So it's kind of like a guiding philosophy, but it's all about people being free. And the interesting thing is the paradigm shift started towards neoliberalism in the 1970s, and it was and the advocates of it started adopting language from the 1960s, because the 1960s was this great cultural revolution, cultural renaissance in the US, where the language was be free. I want to be who I want to be. I want to climb a tree and play the flute or barefoot. And so then this neoliberal libertarian language came around that said, hey, yeah, you can be free. You can do what you want to be. You can do whatever it is and make money. But then it just got more and more on steroids and became more hyper capitalism because it was more and more about make money first and foremost, more than anything.
Well, freedom is a lofty ideal, but it has to be coupled with responsibility. And if it's freedom that is, discoupled from responsibility, then you can do anything you want to anyone you want in the name of freedom. Yeah. So, in the Reagan era, he talked about trickle down economics. You mentioned that a little bit before. And
Hmm.
of course, that never really works. The working classes don't get the trickle down from the rich as they're supposed to. But you talk about trickle up economics. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and that's where we're really at. So trickle down supply side economics was this is what the Reagan Revolution did: cut taxes for the wealth class. They have more money and they'll then create jobs and it will trickle down to everyone else. And that turned out to be a bunch of hooey. And it just keeps it's really a cult because it just keeps going on. So what I mean by trickle up economics, and this is where the wealth inequality has reached such extreme proportions, in that the money that most of the money that feeds the wealth class is coming out of our pockets, so that it's extractive capitalism. It comes out of our pockets and trickles up to them, and also the resources, the natural resources of the earth, fossil fuels and minerals, water, all those things also are extracted out of the earth and go for further profits. I mean, the problem with climate change is this extractive mentality, and it's addicted to making more money at the cost of who cares,
Yeah.
basically.
Well, a
Yeah.
lot of that's woven into debt also, because when you borrow $100,000 and you have to pay back $120,000, then you got to take it from somewhere. And when that keeps going, we have to keep extracting. So, talk to us a bit about debt, because you go into that in the book too. What did Alexander Hamilton get right about debt? And then
Uh-huh.
what's wrong about it, in that, so many Americans are just in a downward spiral of debt that they can't get out of,
Oh, yeah.
and people are dying. You say an average debt of 62,000 upon each person's death.
Oh, debt is strangling people. It's yeah. Alexander How but the chapter I have on economic democracy, I start out mentioning Alexander Hamilton, and I put my tongue in my cheek and say, before we all knew Alexander Hamilton as a star of a great smash Broadway play, and he was
Yeah.
hobnobbing with celebrities, he was first Treasury Secretary of the United States. So I'll talk about his understanding of debt and then talk about what debt is now. Um, he understood, he looked at it, how a nation can become prosperous, and he was brilliant, and he convinced Congress and the president at the time, Washington, that the United States should create a national bank, and the national bank should issue money and take on debt, public debt, to create what the country needed. And it was that philosophy that allowed the country, the United States, to grow, for better or worse, but to grow. And
They grew on the interest of the debt, right?
Well, it grew because of the debt, because expenditures were made
I see.
and we're able to invest. And that's a big understanding about the difference. You hear all these people talking about debt, the national debt. But what they're missing is that a government debt is not like a household debt. If I owe somebody $10, I'm $10 in debt. But if the government has a debt of $10, that's a surplus for somebody else or for society. Of course, $10 is nothing. If the government, $1 billion, talking in scale, the government has $1 billion they just put out for something. They have a debt of a
Weapons in
billion.
Ukraine.
Yeah, but that's a surplus, especially if they put it into public goods of this country. Let's say if there was a national healthcare system, a Medicare for all, that's a surplus for the people. So that is good debt. But then again, this household debt is a mega problem in the United States. I mean, it's a problem that's causing people to drown. as I said, people are drowning in debt. You mentioned that today that 75%, the statistics, 75% of Americans die with 62,000 in debt. So the debt people accrue, consumer debt, credit card debt, auto loans, medical debt. I think it's 75% of some really high percentage of Americans have medical debt, and the great majority have medical insurance. So you have people, it's typical or common to see people on GoFundMe to help pay their medical debt. So, and student loan debt, that's another one. It's horrible. And a few others. So it ends up, and I think the average American has 96,000 in debt and ends up, as I said, when they die, 75,000, 62,000 in debt. So, and it's just,
and that just makes the banks richer, right? And the banks are actually manufacturing a lot of that money out of thin air, but then they get the interest and they get rich on the interest.
Yeah. And it's an ironic thing. Yeah, banks create money. 97% of the money in circulation is created by banks out of, as you say, thin air, conjuring money, just pressing a few buttons on the computer. I mean, banks, commercial banks get their money from the Federal Reserve, and then they create money, and they create it through loans. And so that's the money in circulation. So it's a debt-oriented system to start with. And then, because you talked about consumerism after, we were talking about it earlier, how Americans have really been indoctrinated to consume, and especially post World War II.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. We were talking about this before we went public here.
Yeah.
The whole advertising industry. So I think the statistics now is that America economy is fueled by 80% consumption and 20% investment, something like that. So people end up and living and wages have stagnated tremendously. So people aren't making the kind of money they should be being paid, and cost of everything, even before the inflation of this last few months, the cost of everything has gone up manyfold, hundreds of percent for everything. So it's really hard for people to maintain
especially lately.
Yeah. And, you have people working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. I think more than half of Americans, the great number of Americans work at low wage jobs. You have people who are past retirement age working, sometimes full time. And so people are like in hamster wheels, just spinning and spinning, and they need the credit cards, they need the debt to stay ahead. And that's what happened with the financial crash in 2008. The banks wanted to they were playing casino with the money. They had so much money to play with. They just wanted to give it out. They were building derivatives from the housing market, and they kept giving out the money.
And they got bailed out.
Yeah, and then that's a whole nother problem. They got bailed out,
and the average person didn't.
And that created a downward spiral even more. So I have a whole chapter in my book on Wall Street and just their criminal malfeasance. And I have the quote from Bernie Sanders, who says, "The business of Wall Street is fraud."
So you connect the dots between a lot of these things all the way back to Adam Smith's invisible hand, to the flaw, to the Koch brothers, to all this. And then it really makes sense how we got into this mess. So let's now go to the positive side, because the second half of the book is toward a more perfect union, and you have solutions for all this. So let's start with, you talk about a Greek word, eudaimonia. What is it, and how do you distinguish between eudaimonia for all, which I think was the original idea, versus eudaimonia for just the elite few?
Yeah. And just an aside, I just put in my book's website in the chat box.
Great.
Yeah. So eudaimonia is really the underlying theme of my book, and eudaimonia means human flourishing, and it's the thread of thought I mentioned the Greek philosophers and the Enlightenment philosophers and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It's the thread of thought that connects all of them, because eudaimonia, the concept of eudaimonia, human flourishing, comes from the Greek philosophers. They first talked about it, and the Enlightenment philosophers talked about it. John Locke, one of the Enlightenment philosophers, talked about the pursuit of happiness. That was important, and so did the Greek philosophers. But they talked about happiness was tied in with virtue. When we help others, and when the state works with people. So that's what inspired Jefferson to write Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness in the Declaration of Independence. And he was much more interested. He was a contradiction in terms, because he was a brilliant man, a statesman, an architect, wealthy, and a big slave owner. But he put in the Declaration of Independence that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are unalienable rights. And so, and as we talked earlier, James Madison had a different idea, even though he also was inspired by the concept of eudaimonia. And and actually, even though you don't hear the term that much, and maybe this is the first time some people are hearing the term eudaimonia, but the concept of human flourishing is something we should all be aware of. But, and it goes back to what I was saying about the subtitle of my book, From Scarcity to Abundance for All, that there's abundance for the privileged and scarcity for the rest. So abundance is that human flourishing. Certain people can flourish because they just are in the right place. Maybe they won the genetic lottery and were born to a wealthy family and were heirs to a fortune. So eudaimonia for all is really, how do we make a society where it's egalitarian rights for everyone? Everybody has the right to flourish. We're creating a healthcare system that works for people, giving everyone chance through education. Finally gave women the right to vote 100 years ago, but all the possibilities for people to flourish, which does not exist in our society. And because of that, and every time there's government legislation or talk in general about, oh, let's do something for a certain segment of the population, or a Build Back Better Act, then the backlash is, oh, that's socialism, or the big one, we can't afford that, the deficit, we just can't afford that. But
we can afford to give tax breaks to the rich.
Yeah, tax breaks for the rich and military budget, no problem. But afford what's necessary. But there is a path forward to that. And the thing is, and this is why in my book I talk a lot about numerous historical epochs over the history of the United States. I talk about, I go back to the theme often, the 1930s in the United States when Roosevelt was president. That was a time of great eudaimonia, great human flourishing for all. It was probably the greatest period of human flourishing for all in the history of the United States, or not probably, it was. And the famous poet Carl Sandburg wrote a book, a collection of poems called The People, Yes. And that was because the people, the common people, were celebrated as the backbone of the country. And that was because, after the great devastation and destruction of people's lives from the financial crash of the Great Depression, and Roosevelt got elected, he knew what was needed. And in his inaugural speech in 1933, he said, we're going to throw the money changers out. And he went right ahead and created Social Security, guaranteed jobs, unemployment. People were taken care of. And it was the first time that the government really put forth, did the right thing. And what was the secret to it was that the government spent, was about 40%, somewhere between 40 and 50% of the GDP of the United States at the time on public investment.
And that's more similar to some of the other countries you talk about, like the Nordic countries that spend more of their GDP on reinvesting in their citizens and benefits for all.
Yeah, and not just in turn, Western Europe or the social democracies of the world do that in general. They just understand. They don't even think about it, whether it's a conservative government or a liberal government, socialist, progressive government in Nordic or social or the Western or social democracies. They know what they know. You take care of the people, and you don't remove healthcare or education. Just all the basic factors of life that help people flourish. It's, in social democracies, if you lose your job and you're struggling, you don't have to worry that you may end up living on the street. There's support there. There's a safety net that people will be helped. So it's a simple formula.
So one thing I really loved about the book is you take a lot of these really heady subjects and you make it really entertaining by not only talking about people through history, but a lot of modern day icons. You talk about Star Trek, you talk about Aretha Franklin, you talk about the Grateful Dead, and you weave them all into this building. So let's go to Aretha Franklin because she sang a song about respect. And she created a kind of social cohesion with her soul singing. And from that, you went from Aretha Franklin into the common good, into the commons and the public good. So, talk about social cohesion as part of the eudaimonia and how an economic democracy, a social democracy, can support that.
Yeah. Well, I'll start. Yeah. So yeah, I thought that would be a good way to bring up the subject of social cohesion by talking about the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin. Um, And yeah, so the World Happiness Report, which comes out of the UN every year since I think 2012, every year uh, um, rates countries on their level of happiness. And the Nordic countries are always the first few countries. The social democracy is always in the top 10, 15, whatever. The United States is about, the last few years have been 18th. And one of the things that the World Happiness Report uses, they report on, or they use as yardsticks for their rankings, is social bonds and social cohesion. And they talk about, this is a quote from their report: should we consider some parts of our society to be off bounds to the profit motive? So I mentioned that because you mentioned the commons, Anadea, and it's and the commons is that part of society that's supposed to be or should be good for everybody, and there's nothing there that's about profit. It's not a commodity.
Like the national park system or the air and
National
water.
park system, yeah, maybe it'll cost you a little bit of money to help maintain it or pay admission, but it's for everybody. And so the United States obviously has less and less of that. We don't have a healthcare system that's a commons. And the this idea of the commons comes actually, I believe, from the 4th century Rome and their public trust doctrine, that the government, there's certain parts of society that the government should take care of. It's a public trust, and the beneficiaries are the citizens. So we've really lost that sense of the commons. In Boston, there's in the downtown, there's the commons, the pub, and I lived in Boston for a while. That's the first time I even heard of the term, but it was a park. In New York, you have Central Park, and that's you consider that a commons. So parks are nice place, or national parks, as you said. So when the social cohesion is stronger, when people really bond together to look for what can we do in which we help everyone, and there's no profit motive, it's just the commons. That's that's when a society flourishes. And so that, again, that's why these social democracies are flourishing, because of that strong social cohesion. So I brought up our Roosevelt's epoch in the 1930s through the 40s, and that paradigm continued even once Roosevelt was no longer around. But the social cohesion was strong. And I give the example when Roosevelt ran for re-election in 1936. He made a lot of enemies, and he had a quote that he said he welcomed the hate of his enemies. But his enemies were the banking industry, because he wrested control of the monetary policy from the banking industry. So he had the banking industry and the media. About 75% of the media was against him, and then the Republican Party. So there was a lot of money, a lot of power to stop Roosevelt's reelection, but he won in a landslide because the people were behind him, and that's the social cohesion was strong. And that period has continued in the United States when Lyndon Johnson was president in the 60s, and he took it, he had that concept of Great Society. He had the number of the two great civil rights laws passed, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And that's, again, the social cohesion was strong, and things like that got passed.
Mm-hmm. Well, lots of information here. We want to get the through lines.
Yeah.
So you talk about universal basic income as a way to solve some of this economic inequality and free people from the cycle of debt and give them a little more free time to make a contribution and just take some of the weight off. And that's where you also brought in Star Trek, that, you know, it was 300 years to the future, and they said, no, we don't have money anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the idyllic aspirational future, is to get to the point where we live in a moneyless society. I wrote an essay a couple of weeks ago on Substack, where I've been writing a lot of essays about money and kind of tracing the history of money, and just saying it's really a fiction, it's a creation that we give meaning to. But that's again the aspect, and it's kind of a conundrum because we need money to pay our bills, but it ties in with this crazy greed that the wealth class just go after money and have no
I
thoughts
think
of.
actually we should see money as a potential for addiction. It seems that the more people have, the more they want, and the more they're willing to sacrifice their own health and the well-being of others to get more and more, which is what people do when they're under the influence of an addiction. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so talk a little bit about universal basic income and how you see that alleviating the problem, and that the money for that actually does exist.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so I think that's part of a big part of achieving a more human flourishing for all. So I say in my book that really what we need is putting, if there are public goods, people should be at the core of the public goods, every one of us. And with a lot of people struggling, it really seems like a universal basic income is really a no-brainer. And I add on to that, not only universal basic income, but but some people call it a legacy account. The French economist Thomas Piketty calls it a universal capital endowment. I think that's the term he used, where people are given money at birth that they don't touch till a certain age. Piketty actually has suggested that figure be $180,000 that every person is given at birth, but that they don't touch till age 25. So between a universal basic income, it allows people just to breathe a little easier, not knowing that, oh, where am I going to get this money from? And there's been enough universal basic income experiments throughout the United States and world now, and they're always studied after, and it really always shows that people really just were so much better off by having that extra money. And in a way, the United States had a universal basic income last year from about March, April, whenever it started, the expanded child tax credit of I think it was $3,000 per child over 6 and $3,500 child under 6. And I think people received monthly checks, and it was found to alleviate poverty at a great level. So there's a couple of arguments against universal basic income. One is, oh, people won't work. They'll just, and that's a trope that has always been said, oh, people will just spend it on booze and drugs and,
That's
anything.
not actually what happens in the places where it's been tried out.
No, it's money that just alleviates so much struggle and suffering, and people use it well. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, the big argument is, oh, we just don't have enough money to pay for it. And that's a trope also, because as I say in my book, over the last 13, 14 years, the banks were bailed out and given just about $50 trillion. And they had a universal basic income and they had a debt jubilee. But why can't that money be given? And there's a very simple way it can be done is the United States government sets up a national investment bank. And just like the United States government, when they need money, they print up treasury bonds that people buy, investors buy, or the Federal Reserve buys, and that the government gets their money. So the government can, creating a national investment bank, the government creates treasury bonds and the Federal Reserve can buy them. The National Investment Bank can allocate that money to for whether universal basic income or just public investment. And actually there's a second way to pay for universal basic income. And it's really in a very simple way, is that we all have, every person in the United States has an account at the Federal Reserve. I mean, why can't people have it? Every bank in the United States has it, and the banks get money allocated to them. As I said, they get a universal basic income, so to speak. So every person could have money, an account at the Federal Reserve, and every month the Federal Reserve can just on a couple of clicks of computer just put money in every person's account. $1,000 a month or whatever the amount is, 500, 1,000, 1,500. And it's
Yeah. It's not as impossible as we think.
yeah.
Hard for people in the scarcity mentality to get their head around it. We're so inured to the workaday, the work ethic, the Christian work ethic. Well, I want to encourage people to put some questions in the chat box, or in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand. We don't have a webinar where people are actually seen on screen, but you can either write it in the chat or put it in the Q&A. I got a couple more questions I want to ask you, and then we'll turn it over to see what other people have.
Yeah.
So you talk about economic democracy, and different than the plutocracy we have right now, and you talked earlier, you referenced that we have a tyranny of the minority, that the minority is ruling and then they're calling the shots and they have the money to support the candidates, and then the candidates represent the minority of people, but they win anyway. Electoral college shows us, how you can win without winning the popular vote. So you talk about an economic democracy as, tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, Teddy Roosevelt famously said that you can't have a political democracy without an economic democracy, and they go hand in hand. And as we were talking about earlier, if there's not an economic democracy, if there's this great wealth inequality, the wealth class can, as happens right now, can give money to politicians. And these days, it's really easy with dark money and get the agenda set in their favor. It happens all the time. Joe Manchin killed the Build Back Better Act because he had, money patrons who were wanting him to protect him. So an economic democracy is really just what we've been talking about, of creating abundance for all, where human flourishing for all, where everybody can do well. And again, the United States in the 1930s had the closest it had, or did have, an economic democracy where everybody was taken care of, or was allowed to prosper or thrive. And then in the post-World War II, beginning in about 1945 through about 1980, was the greatest era of human flourishing, the greatest decades of human prosperity in the United States, of flourishing, of somewhat, not 100%, but much more of an economic fair playing ground. if there was not great wealth inequality in every class of people, from the wealthy to the middle class to the working class to the poor, each had a proportionate amount of the national income, and it was very fair in that period, and 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 it was because of the New Deal, even through Richard Nixon, who did a lot of horrible things, but he adhered to that also, that same economic democracy. So it can be done. It's very doable, and it goes hand in hand with the political democracy. And I really think, as we talked about universal basic income, that's an important part of it. And it's also all the other public goods: healthcare, education, transportation, taking care of the planet, and so on.
And you talk about achieving that through a ranked choice voting, which breaks the duopoly of the Republican Democrat thing where everything is just pitted
Uh-huh.
against each other, and that candidates have, ranked choice voting. I think we did a whole interview on that a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
as a way to bring about this economic democracy. Well, what about, so here's this utopian ideal of abundance for all, and that, the world of work is going away and we get a universal basic income, and our freedoms and all of that. So what about the finite resources of the planet if we have abundance for all?
Yeah. Well, obviously this
Because
is,
that's finite.
yeah, this is where we take care of the planet, and we are facing, impending catastrophe potential. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 10 years, who knows exactly, but every day, we see what the weather's like, and the drought in the southwest part of the country, and so on. So that gets into the whole, what we were talking about earlier, of consumption, and of our system, our economic system, capitalism, based on growth in GDP. We just can't continue consuming the resources of this country. We have to think about it. So talking about economic democracy, a big thing that came up a few years ago is the concept of the Green New Deal. And just like universal basic income, a Green New Deal can be paid for the same way, what I mentioned about a national investment bank, where the money goes into that, treasury bonds, Federal Reserve buys in the money, and it can pay for creating a whole new paradigm in terms of sustainability, renewals, regeneration. And it's all right there for the taking, with the change of mindset, from greed towards social cohesion, collaboration. And that's, we have to protect our planet. What good? And some capitalists realize that, knowing if we don't have a planet, we can't make any money.
That's right. It's the warehouse that we're drawing from to sell the goods. And when the
Yeah.
warehouse is empty, there's no bailout that's going to replace that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, I want to encourage people to write some questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. I realize my notes are covering the chat. Maybe I'm missing them. But your website, where people can get the book, because the book really goes into this piece by piece. And it's a little easier to connect all the dots and follow it and see how this all goes. So where they can get it, and also about how to get involved. So what people can actually do. You have that on your website.
Yeah. So I put the website in the chat box just before. It's more perfect union solutions. And I felt that the solutions was a big part of it. And I have a section on my website called Get Involved, because I didn't want to just write everything I wrote and the solutions. And my hope is that when someone reads the book and they finish it, they will feel inspired and then say, okay, what do we do?
That's
So
right.
what I want to do to start with is you can go on my website and sign up, but it's, and I have a little video on that Get Involved page, is have a book club slash discussion group slash class that will be on a pay what you want basis. And it will be, I'm thinking 6-week program, dissecting the book 3 chapters at a time. There's 18 chapters, and really to help people understand all these ideas. You're sitting here listening, and I've thrown out a lot. As Anadea said, there's a lot in my book, but the more you wrap your mind around it, the more you'll understand where I'm coming from with the ideas. And then, from there, the hope is to build a community of people wanting to do something. And I think in my mind, there's a plan. Like Anadea, we had on a couple of interviews ago, Richard Lang with the
Right.
advisory voting. I think what we need is more, political democracy, economic democracy. We need more direct democracy. Advisory voting was that, and citizen assemblies that I talk about in my book is a really important thing also. And I think it's changed constitutions in other countries, the citizen assemblies. And I think we need to create a citizen assembly and start whether changing how Congress elected or creating a whole new Congress or system. We had on Bo Breslin a few months ago, rewriting the Constitution.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, it starts with the get involved section. Of course, it starts with hopefully reading my book if you're so inclined and excited enough by what I'm talking about and want to wrap your mind around some big ideas.
Citizens assemblies are randomly selected people that cut across all sorts of different social classes that come together to discuss issues. And you talk in your book about how Ireland did that, and that's how they, got the right to gay marriage and abortion passed through the citizens assemblies. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you want to ask Michael?
Yeah, feel free.
Questions in the chat box. This is very quiet here.
Yeah, maybe that if people haven't read my book and can, because it just came out today.
Yeah.
But I hope you can buy either the hardcover, paperback, or ebook. You'll really get the gist of where I'm coming from. It's it's a
So
lot
if you
of
were to summarize all this detail, in just the big broad strokes of, from the invisible hand that assumes the best of people but had a flaw and that people didn't do their best, to a eudaimonia where people are really watching out for each other. I mean, what's the through line here in a broad stroke?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, and just making eudaimonia, human flourishing for all, where we think of the commons, the public goods of society. You mentioned Anadea, the Star Trek, when I give the Star Trek example, and I was saying one of the things that made the Star Trek Federation what it was, though it's a science fiction situation, but they had the replicator that could create anything. Now that day may never come, but what the example of the replicator was that's very important, relevant to this discussion, was that somebody invented this replicator that could create anything, but in creating it, it was available to everybody for no charge. If by happenstance Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or somebody created it in our society, the price tag to create anything could be $1 million. And then again, it would be abundance for the privileged. And the rest of us would be sitting there going, oh, we don't have nothing. We got nothing. And so as the Star Trek society, one, it was a moneyless society. There was no price on anything, but people could create anything. And it was abundant in that way. So in a way, I call the book a political, economic, psychological, and spiritual exploration, because ultimately this concept of abundance really is a spiritual opening of the heart and mind, and the gift of giving.
Mm-hmm. So we do have a question coming in from Newtopia. What do you think of the new space economy?
I'm actually not sure what you mean by that, Newtopia. I don't know if you mean Jeff Bezos flying off in space. So could you say a little more?
Elon Musk with SpaceX.
So you want to type in there what you mean? But yeah, I'm no fan of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk.
In a way, when you talk about the replicator, of course, in Star Trek, it was free, but Jeff Bezos has almost created that, in that we can go on to Amazon and you just push a button and instead of having it immediately, it arrives the next day, you know, and you pay for it, of course, and it's making Jeff Bezos rich. And he has agreed to spend some $11 billion or something on climate change. I mean, he's at least, doing some philanthropy, and his ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott, is doing an enormous amount of philanthropy with
Yeah. And so yeah, this is the
Amazon
whole
money.
yeah, this is the whole issue with billionaires. And some are doing good. Um, some of them are making sure they do good by also doing well for themselves financially. But it's an odd thing to have all these billionaires. Not too long ago, during that era, rose from the 1930s to 1980, the highest marginal tax bracket that people paid was 80%. So that was the revolution that Reagan created, because he slashed it in less than half. So it was almost like a salary cap, a maximum income people could make, because after a while they were
Yeah,
paying taxes. So they just said, okay, well, I don't need to make that much money. They stopped. But now in this neoliberal age, between paying less taxes and then having so many mechanisms to avoid paying taxes, money laundering. I talk a little bit about money laundering in my book, and kleptocracy.
yeah,
But there's so many ways. As well known, Elon Musk for a few years didn't pay any tax. So you end up with billionaires who think they can do good, but who appointed them God? Who appointed, you
yeah,
know, Elon Musk may be the most powerful unelected
yeah.
person in the universe right now that he's going to own Twitter.
And that's been said of Mark Zuckerberg too.
Yeah,
They know,
yeah.
Newtopia came back and asked, "Do you think we should have a maximum wage?" You talk about a minimum. We have minimum wage. Should we have a maximum wage?
Oh, totally. That was kind of that was with the high marginal tax rates. That was pretty much a maximum wage. And it's been well talked about the difference in the ratio of the top earner company, the CEO, versus the average earner is, a few thousand to one, where it used to be 20 to one. And there should be, as is done in some countries of social democracies, on the boards of companies, the workers should also be on the board, because when you have boards made up of wealthy people, the shareholders, all they care about is making more money. And when the CEOs and top executives, their salary is more shares than salary, they just want to see the stock price go up, and they have a very simple way. They just keep buying back stock.
Yeah,
And so the system is truly rigged. And
yeah,
yeah, maximum wage is one way to an antidote for that.
yeah.
So yeah,
Any
and
other questions here?
yeah, the thing is, these are things that were already, that have been there already. So
Yeah.
there are models for this. It's not like, oh, let's do something radical that's
Well,
never
we
been
did a
done.
little bit of universal basic income during the pandemic when people got the stimulus checks. I mean, it wasn't the monthly stipend of getting 1,000 a month, but people did get some handouts to get them through, and that made a big difference to a lot of people.
Yeah, that was pretty radical, or in a certain way, that the government just rushed in. It was like a chink in the armor of neoliberalism, because all of a sudden the government came in and gave money to people.
Yeah,
It was a taste of what could be. Oh, but then there was the argument, oh, we got to stop giving money to people because all these businesses don't have workers anymore. They make more money getting government assistance, unemployment, than working. Well, they I don't blame them. Working
yeah,
at a shift job, or taking money and having
yeah.
a choice.
Well, I don't see any other. Oh, here's one from Stuart. Thanks, Michael, for all the work you've done and your care and passion to make a difference. How can we promote ranked choice voting? Are you supporting the People's Party, the Green Party, the Forward Party?
Oh, I know the Green Party. And I know, I'm not sure of the other parties that you're mentioning, Stuart. But yeah, ranked choice voting. There's a few areas now that have it.
He's asking how we, the people, can support it.
Well, this is what I was talking about, like advisory voting, citizen assemblies, because this is part of reforming political democracy. You touched on it earlier, Anadea. ranked choice voting, multi-member, and I talk about in my book, multi-member congressional districts,
Yeah.
get rid of the electoral college. And the vested interests don't want to see these kinds of things. And it's, the plutocracy, the oligarchy also wants it the status quo because it's going very well for them. So this is part of the get involved aspect of my website, my book. Just we need to have a movement.
Yeah. People need to be more informed about it. And it does actually exist in Maine, for example, and
Right.
in some local governments.
And exists in other countries too. The United
Yeah.
States is the outlier in so many things. And we have the of all the developed nations, we have the worst voter turnout too. So, because people see the system's rigged and they say, why should I vote for the lesser of two evils, Tweedledee, Tweedledum? They're both going to, not
My
care.
vote doesn't count. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and what happens with that is that um, you have this right-wing populist movement in the United States, around the world, who are demagogues who talk it up like the elites are screwing you over. Donald Trump did this, and many others. The elites are screwing you over. We'll take care of you and help you. Where all they really care about is robbing the treasury of the nation. They're kleptocrats.
Yeah.
But people are so screwed over, they fall for it, hook, line, and sinker. And that's where this right-wing populist. So yeah. Thanks for asking that question, Stuart. It's an interesting thing that happened in France with the vote, that Macron, the centrist candidate, won over the far right candidate, Le Pen, who had the best showing ever. But a lot of people were looking at this, the lesser of two evils, Macron, the neoliberal person, versus the far right person.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that was a close one. Or, we were biting our nails over that.
Yeah.
He did win by a pretty good margin, but I was certainly biting my nails over that one, because
Yeah.
that could have been a whole difference in how this war in Ukraine goes if Marine Le Pen had been, in Putin's pocket. Yeah. Well, there are no more questions, and so maybe we should wrap it up.
Yeah.
Once again, the book is Toward a More Perfect Union: From Scarcity to Abundance for All. And it's just amazing storytelling, written with a lot of wit and humor and an amazing grasp of detail. And it just draws the lines from this point to this point to this point. And you're really convinced by the end. And I, for one, want everybody to read it, because I think, oh yeah, this does paint the picture and show how we can get out of it. If enough people can read it and understand these ideas and talk about them, that's part of what we can do. So Susan says, thanks, Michael. Can't wait to read your book.
Yep.
And you can go to moreperfectunion.solutions and find out how you can get involved and how you can get the book. And we'll send out the recording. There's a lot of information even in this interview.
Yeah. That's a lot. Well,
so I'm glad I got a chance to read it twice. I'll probably read it again after 6 months or so. And really happy to do what I can to help support this wonderful piece of work.
Yeah, well, thank you, Anna Day. And Stuart just wrote, the forward party was started by Andrew Yang. And we spoke about it in conversation in January with Marianne Williamson. More about the People's Party on peoplesparty.org.
Yeah,
right,
and I have heard the People's Party, yeah.
Yeah, and I think most people are aware that Andrew Yang ran for president on the platform of universal basic income.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for coming and being our loyal listeners. The next one will be on May 19th with Locke Kelly.
Yeah, a teacher of awakening, meditation and awakening.
All right, that'll be great. Yeah. And then we'll have Hazel Henderson in June
23rd, longtime progressive economist.
That's right. And Gary Malkin about music for transformation in July.
Yeah, great.
So those are upcoming dates. Stay tuned. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. I hope you do well with this book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Till next time. Peace out.
All right.
Bye.